Welcome to another episode of Due Diligence, a real estate podcast. And I'm back here continuously quarantined, sheltered in place. Thank God, not 24/7 with my colleague, Lee Taylor, real estate expert, Lee Taylor. I'm Jason Wieloch, here live again on behalf of the Wieloch Group at Compass. And over the last year, and since COVID's begun, live on YouTube, saved to Apple, Spotify, all over the interwebs, and at our site, wielochgroup.com. We're live once again, Lee. And how are you doing, buddy?
I'm fantabulous. It's been a really, really good week so far. We're getting rain every day in Atlanta too. It's nice.
It's been a little cloudier, a little rainier.
Nice.
And I'm about to add a little ray of sunshine because we are
cool guest.
We are about to introduce one of my good friends, and him and I go back because he was introduced to me via a friend in Miami, a real estate agent named Jordan. Or who's my friend? Azam, tell me, who am I talking here?
Jordan Kramer,
Jordan Kramer, my Miami buddy. And he bought an investment property here in Atlanta. And he is the bureau chief for the New York Times down in Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean. And he's my good friend, Azam Ahmed. What's up, man? Welcome to the show.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me. It's good to see you both.
Yeah, you too.
You look good.
Oh, you guys look good too.
You look healthy. Are you eating well down there?
I'm eating well.
Street tacos?
It's hard not to eat well in Mexico. Unfortunately, the street tacos have dried up as they should have. But yeah, it's still, most of the restaurants are still delivering, and yeah, it's been actually surprisingly easy to still eat well.
When did quarantine and stay in place start in Mexico City?
It started very end of March, beginning of April.
Yeah.
For those of us looking at New York and Italy, elsewhere where the pandemic hit strong, I think there was a lot of concern that Mexico wasn't shutting down early enough. But in reality, for when it arrived here, I think they shut down relatively early in the cycle.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, you live down in Mexico City. And as a brief bio, were the bureau chief previously in Kabul, Afghanistan, right?
That's right.
And you are now in Mexico City doing your gig, a little bit of a change of scenery from your last post, probably a little more fun, social to hang out in Mexico City than Kabul, but you travel quite frequently. One thing I've noticed is that it's probably fortunate if I flew into Mexico City and actually you were there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. COVID has been a grounding experience.
Sure.
I haven't traveled for the last couple of months. Obviously, we've been, sorry if there's some noise here. They're doing work on the building. It's literally right outside of my door. Yeah, I know, lucky me. But yeah, normally I'm traveling 60 to 70% of the time, either in Central America, in the Caribbean, up to the States occasionally, and then within Mexico quite a lot. I live in Mexico City. But I guess the benefit and the downside of COVID is, for the first time in years, I've actually sat still and not traveled for more than a month, which is interesting. It's sort of, on the one hand, it's, I'm going stir crazy. On the other hand, I'm like, well, it's kind of nice to not be awaiting my next trip, day by day.
So tell our listeners, how has Mexico, especially, you're probably very familiar. I mean, you're probably familiar with the whole region and their response, but being in Mexico City, what's the atmosphere like? How has the virus impacted you versus, say, like a New York City or another major American city? What's the response down there? What's the atmosphere? How is day-to-day life south of the border?
So I would say you've got kind of a dichotomy in some ways. First off, you've been to Mexico City, Jason. Lee, I'm not sure if you've been, but it is normally an extraordinarily congested, packed mega city. And you drive around now, or you walk around now, and it feels a bit like a ghost town. It's almost like 28 days later. It's alarming in some ways. You're just thinking, oh my God, where is everyone? And so I think actually, though the government didn't force people to stay inside, it was more of a suggestion. A lot of people have taken it to heart. I think, as in any economy that's developed but has a lot of inequality, you see people who are poor, of less means, they can't really afford to stay at home. I've interviewed dozens of them, and they all tell me the same thing, which is, I'm more scared of starving than I am of a virus. I don't know if I'm going to get the virus. I don't know if it'll kill me if I do get it, but I do know if I don't go out and work, because I live day by day, that I'm not going to be able to feed my kids. And so there's been, even within those pockets, there's been a lot of adherence to this quarantine, the suggested quarantine. But yeah, I think quarantining is also a luxury that a lot of people in the region as well can't necessarily afford to observe.
Have you seen it impact you may not pay directly attention to real estate. We do, obviously, daily. Has it impacted the market there in a positive or negative way that you've observed, the housing market?
I mean, I'd be surprised if there were anywhere in the world that COVID was affecting a housing market in a positive way. I do actually kind of keep tabs on real estate here. I mean, I love Mexico City. It's a great place to live. And just generally, I'm always interested in real estate. And so far, I think it's hard to know exactly how it's been. I mean, I assume much like Atlanta, people are still transacting, but it's gone down precipitously. This market had also become extremely rich and popular with foreigners and locals alike, especially in the neighborhood like where I live, for instance, or the Roma, Condesa, Polanco, kind of the nicer areas. The prices had gone up, double digits every year for the last several years. I think you've seen a severe slowdown. There's a glut of homes for sale in places like Polanco. And so I think probably what you're going to see is in the next year, especially as the real implications for the economy hit, prices are going to go down quite a bit, is my suspicion.
Well, we've got a lot of the same debates here, Lee, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I was thinking about what he said about Mexico City being a little bit of a ghost town. And I've heard from friends who own in Greenwich Village and have stayed out at, they have a place in the Hamptons. And they really did say that New York felt like a ghost town. They said that yesterday. So I imagine what we're seeing in Atlanta is radically different, Jason. We are not a ghost town whatsoever.
No, not at
all.
Atlanta. No way.
What's going on in Atlanta? I haven't followed it.
Well, we had one of our busiest months ever real estate wise, if you can believe it. And trust me, Lee and I did not predict that.
No.
What?
Yeah. I know, right? So
are people wearing masks? I mean, are they like?
Yeah,
but they're still
a
going out.
A lot less this week. A lot less this week. A lot less masks.
So what's the temperatures? If people don't believe that COVID is a real thing, or they think they're just sick and tired of being locked up? Because I mean, in New York, for instance, it's still, as Lee was saying, it's still a ghost town in a lot of the big cities worldwide.
And there's people I know beyond ghost town. My friends are saying they're not coming back to Manhattan. They don't want to live in Manhattan anymore. And they want to move to the Hamptons or Long Island or places like that. So back to Atlanta. It starts with Governor Kemp and our state laws. And we were the first state in the union to immediately have a more free economy. And that was over 4 weeks ago.
Wow.
He stood in front of the state and said, we're going to open back up tattoo parlors, bowling alleys, hairdressing and barbershops, nail salons, etc. Now, he had a large list of essential services, and we happened to be one of them. It was called real estate services, and you can name it from a handyman to a crane operator to a realtor to a closing attorney. We were all called essential.
Yeah.
Well, and to answer, I think the question of how do we differ? Why do people have the attitudes we do? Part of it, Azam, is that we haven't had the spike in cases. So it gets to a point where you don't have this crazy spike. How much longer can you hold the economy and people? And fortunately, the last couple of weeks since we've sort of opened back up, we still have remained super low on cases. I think a lot of it has to do with, we had a real estate expert from New York, Mike Sandak, on last week. We don't have a ton of people taking public transportation. A lot of people go to their jobs in cars. You can easily stay more separated in certain large cities than you can in a place like in New York. Like, we're not shoulder.
You're not as dense.
Yeah, we're just, and we don't have the opportunity where we have to sort of brush against each other as frequently. And I think that that's unfortunately been a big benefit to us not being a city that has that infrastructure.
Yeah. It's still a substantially different city. I mean, the first employer to cut was Delta at like 40%. Right. And that was in March. 40% of the workforce either furloughed, cut, let go, given leaves of absences or whatever they might have called it. But and then it went deeper at Delta. So you can imagine what that does to the entire economy. Just one employer like Delta.
Well, I want to ask you another couple questions. Tell me,
please.
And I've just so enjoyed getting to know you through Jordan. And sorry, Jordan, I just lost the last name. I was just so overcome with joy to see you on the show. Actually saw him in Miami after I saw you. But in short, you've had such an incredible career in journalism at such a young age. Very impressed. And I enjoy just listening to you. You've got great perspective. What can you recall as the most interesting assignment as a journalist that you've been on to date? What has been your favorite story or event to cover?
Oof, man, that's so hard. It's
Tough
sort
one.
of
I told
when
you
you
I'd
kind
get powder puffs, but then I threw that out.
You just threw me a curveball. No, it's sort of one of those perfect softies because I could hit it in 17 different ways. Like I think the most impactful for me was becoming a war correspondent. I'd always wanted to be a war correspondent. I always felt like that kind of coverage was defining of the profession of journalism, going out there without fear or favor and covering what's happening in the world. And I think war and violence generally is one of the worst things humans can wage on one another. And so covering it as diligently as possible to me is it's a cornerstone of the profession. Now, I was younger then and I had less sort of experience and wasn't able to do what I did last year, for instance, which was like a 10-part series on violence and the homicide crisis throughout all of Latin America. Traveled to 6 different countries, did 10 different stories, all of them several thousand words, all of them investigative, all of them that ran on the front page of the New York Times. And so that allowed me to delve into something that, again, keeping with the theme of violence and human violence, I was able to take a new sort of novel approach and go all the way in. So both of those in some ways were really revelatory for me as a writer and as a journalist, to be able to see what a war looks like from the front lines. One war waged by the United States that by nearly every account, even the governments these days, I think was a failed endeavor, and understand the implications it has for the nations where that war is waged. And then here in Mexico, it's been a different intellectual challenge. You cover a war that involves the United States, and that is the story. You have your narrative through line. You have what interests your readership. You come somewhere like Mexico, and either people think they know everything about it, like, oh, it's all narcos and NAFTA, or you have to show them a different way to think about it or convince them that there is a story here worth reading and worth following up on. So in 2017, I did a series of stories that from the outside sort of looked like a common theme, which is corruption in Mexico. But after living here, and I came here in mid-2015, after being here about a year and a half, it dawned on me just how widespread and embedded and entrenched in the political culture corruption was. So I did a series of stories, an investigative series on the government's acquisition of this very, very specialized spyware that they were using against human rights activists, lawyers, and journalists, including myself. And that was yet another way to find a way into how to cover and define a region or regional coverage. So I would say the thing that most, you have that you always want to feel like there's something sublime or something awe-inspiring about what you're doing. If you're going to be a foreign correspondent, something captivates you. And I think going to a war zone and traveling to the far reaches of Afghanistan, places that few people in the world have ever seen, that was truly awe-inspiring. Whereas coming to Mexico, it was in some ways more of an intellectual process of trying to figure out, how do I write about this in a coherent way? Because my job isn't to write for a Mexican audience necessarily or a US audience necessarily, but how do I posit Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean in the broader global dialogue? Where does it belong? How should we think about it? Mm-hmm. What sort of details are the ones that I should focus on? Because I can't write every day. I do longer form pieces more periodically.
I mean, beautifully stated. What can I say?
Yeah, that's really cool.
We just sell houses.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You do a damn good job, guys.
I've been to war, so we got both of us got one on you.
Yeah, Lee is retired captain, and was in Desert Storm in 1990.
We talked about it.
That's right. Yeah. We had a Fox 5 journalist with us for 2 weeks in the early part. It was gone by wartime. You've seen some real shit, man. So hats off to you, man. I appreciate that the New York Times has kept you, I guess, is the other thing. I don't know if you had choices after Kabul, but thank God they, gave you something that you'll never ever get anywhere else. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, the Times has become this flashpoint for a lot of people because the country's become so polarized, much like Mexico. But they've, the opportunity to go to a place like Afghanistan and cover it as I saw it, as we felt, it was the most down the line, neutral, but honest coverage. It's been, yeah. And they gave me the choice afterwards. I finished there as a bureau chief, and they asked where I wanted to go next. And I had a couple of choices, but at the top of the list was Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean because, well, for a number of reasons, but yeah, it intrigued me.
The nightlife's better.
There's so many questions I want to ask about Afghanistan. I just don't want to go down the rabbit hole.
Let's go, man. I'm ready if Jason permits.
I'd like to know if you were, how is the heroin production, and we know what they do there to make the economy churn. Is it as blatant as I would imagine it to be, like tobacco or cotton or other types of textile production? No, not textile, but plants and agriculture in the United States? Is it
That's a great question. And that was the last project I did, was on poppy production, and how every year they were sort of outpacing themselves for record yields of opium. It is not as obvious as, say, cotton or other sorts of agricultural products in the United States, except in certain regions. Like, first off, it grows better in certain regions towards the south and the drier landscapes near the desert. But second off, they're not going to grow this in highly populated areas like Kabul because it's a little bit too much. It's too much in the face. But I remember going down to an area in Helmand province, which is in the southwest. And literally one of the big stories that we did was I realized that the state governor and the municipal governor were charging taxes as though it were a regular crop for poppy production. It was astounding to me, just seeing how these guys were basically like, oh, okay, you're growing a hectare, that means you owe me this amount. Like, there was no effort whatsoever to impose the rule of law. In fact, it was just more like a profitable opportunity to tax something they knew would be grown and would produce, would generate income.
And their supply chain is basically the illegal supply chain of the world, right? This isn't like legitimized into pharmaceutical production in Pakistan or something.
Unlike
right?
Turkey, like Turkey produces a lot of pharmaceutical heroin for various sort of painkillers.
Sure.
This is almost exclusively illegal. What's interesting is very little of it comes to the United States. It's mostly Europe and other parts of the more Eastern Hemisphere. Because I remember looking into that, wondering how much of the record production was going to the United States, and it turned out not that much.
Okay, I got another crazy question. You got one? I got a crazy question.
Well, mine will be transition. So do you have another?
Yeah, one more. So, Azam, have you ever heard of a guy named George Friedman, who is the president of a company called Stratfor?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so you heard of his book called The Next 100 Years? It was written about 12 years ago.
I have not read that book. No, I'm not familiar with it.
He presupposes that by the 2075, 2080s in the future, that there will be a civil war between, not a civil war, but a border war between Mexico and the United States based on the border states, and in such a way that the original territories that were once Mexico's will be taken back in a border war with the strength primarily of illegal guns. It's a very wild story, but his book, The Next 100 Years, has all kinds of conjecture in it, going from space war to ground war on the Mexican border of California and New Mexico. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I don't see that happening, but
hey, we are a real estate
it's
podcast,
an interesting,
and we're talking about taking real estate.
That's
here,
right. That's what it's taking territory, baby.
How much would that be worth?
What was the purchase?
I don't know what they called
Louisiana
that.
purchase.
Santa Ana is something, right? What was that?
Yeah, they basically the U.S. just took the property
exactly
for like $1, right?
Stole it.
Well, we are a real estate podcast, and our listeners are probably wondering if we're going to talk about it. And I think I'll do a little fun transition to, because I could talk about this all day. We've talked for hours on end about your journeys, and we'll do it again when you come. But the first time you were interested in investing in a property as an investment, and you stayed with me for a couple of days, and amazingly, you worked for the New York Times and came and saw my Republican family out in the suburbs for came to our holiday party. I mean, oh my God, I thought they were going to annihilate you. And then everybody was hugging it out and drinking bourbon by 11 p.m. It was quite the miracle. But I am interested, as I am in any of my clients' experiences, what has been your real estate experience? To me, you've only bought with me, but how has it gone? What have been your experiences? And then I'd love to talk about Atlanta with you and get your takes on why you chose this place over somewhere else.
I think initially, like I've always been intrigued and fascinated, and always been very fond of Atlanta. I hadn't been that much, but it's this incredibly alluring city in the South. You know, I spent so much of my time in Washington, D.C. and New York. Then you visit Atlanta and you see this incredible array of diversity, and not just diversity of race, but diversity of professions, diversity of interests, diversity of cuisine. You know, I think for many of us who spend a lot of time in New England cities, how diffused Atlanta is can be a little bit confusing and intimidating, but it's also such an interesting contrast. You can find houses where there's trees and yards, and you know, you're not exactly what you said before. It's not as densely packed and therefore as neurotic in some ways as a lot of the bigger, more compacted cities. I've lived in Chicago as well. So I mean, I really love Atlanta. I think it's cool. I love the music. I love the social scene. It's got so much, I think, that is leaning towards what the future of America maybe will look like. You know, these cosmopolitan places that also feel very local and can feel very intimate. Kind of mega cities that are agglomerations of smaller communities jammed together. As far as why I invested there, I mean, I think it was a lot of what we talked about in our first conversation. You know, it's one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. I think more and more people are moving there. It's got real businesses and real industry, unlike a lot of other cities where it's very service sector or financial sector. It's, you know, there's a wide range of employers in a place like Atlanta. And yeah, again, increasingly, whether with climate change or people getting priced out of some of the bigger, you know, more historically popular cities, especially with young professionals, it's becoming more of a magnet. And then, you know, when I came down to visit, I was astounded at all the cool, fun things there were to do in Atlanta.
You underestimated us, I will say. I think that you were pleasantly surprised by how developed we were.
No, I didn't have that sort of New England snooty, you know, vibe. I grew up in Southern Virginia, so I have a very close affinity for the South. It's one of the reasons why I got along so well with your family. Like Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. They were great. They were cool people.
Yeah.
You know, we had a lot of fun just talking and catching up. So it wasn't that I didn't imagine Atlanta would be cool. I didn't imagine it to be cool in so many different ways, perhaps. You know, I know the hip hop scene there is world class. It's legendary. Right. You know, some of my favorite artists come from Atlanta. The nightlife scene is also epic. You know, I knew the restaurants and, you know, the entertainment world would be incredible, but then it was also just, you know, not unlike LA. Sometimes if you go there from a New England city, you're like, God, how long am I going to be stuck in traffic? And like, where is this place? And, you know, it can feel very diffuse. Like there's no center around which the city revolves. But what I found was that in each of these pockets where I went, I found myself having a great time. You know, I found myself enjoying it because of its distinction. It's, you know, its intrigue. It's whatever it brought to the table was something kind of different from another neighborhood, but also complementary. So I think maybe I appreciated the diffusion, whereas before I used to kind of look at that as a liability for cities.
And there was this amazing real estate team just ready to help you.
This is where you ask for a plug.
Wow.
Nah,
bragging.
No, I mean, look, the proof is in the pudding. I bought a place sight unseen because I trusted your analysis on it, and it's turned out well. And you know,
that's not easy to do, and I respect you for that because it's very hard to that's a hard gut check decision.
I think Jordan had a lot to do down in Miami, thanks to him, with building that trust that probably wouldn't have been achieved sight unseen.
Yeah, no, that wouldn't have happened without Jordan for sure, because we just didn't have the time to know each other. But subsequently, yeah, like you said, we've become friends. You know, you've come down to Mexico City twice. I think neither of those times was I here, but you stayed at my place. I came to Atlanta and hung out with you. It's been great.
Beltline. Remember, I introduced you to the Beltline, and you didn't know what you were getting into on a Sunday. We were sort of tired. Admittedly, I hosted you for a weekend last November, and I had no idea it was one of Atlanta's most famous clubs, Tongue and Groove, their 25th anniversary. We ran into my friend Sheldon Baker, who you know, South African guy. All of a sudden, we're in a taxi from Buckhead, and there's Little John performing the 25th. There's a lot of who's who of Atlanta just hanging out on the second floor. And then the next day we were, you know, kind of tired, I guess you'd call it. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden I'm like, Azam, let's go to the Beltline. What is this? It's like the High Line. So we went and walked that for an hour. And I thought that was like a really big epiphany for you of how cool the city had developed when you were able to like see this neighborhood of, again, trees and paths walking right through the city, restaurants, shops, bars, all of that. And it was a ton of fun. And you seriously came in the most perfect time of year because it was like 75 degrees.
Yeah, it was right as fall was hitting, which is my favorite time of the year on the East Coast. I mean, probably fall on the East Coast is my favorite time of year anywhere in the world, where the leaves start to turn. There's that kind of autumnal breeze. It's slightly cold, but not too cold. Yeah, I was really, really impressed. I had such a great time walking that, and seeing how it interconnected the city in the way that they were trying to make a contiguous kind of circle around Atlanta. Like I respected the ambition, and I thought, like, what a cool urban feature. Like what a enjoyable extra element aside from everything else that we'd seen to enjoy in Atlanta.
Lee, I know you're busting at the seam to ask something.
Not really. I just was thinking to just take him to the East Side Beltline. That was at Midtown.
Took him to the East Side. It's where all the traffic, it's where it's developed.
Yeah.
And there's people.
It's really remarkable. Next time, come down to see the West End, which is really transformed around a big old district full of breweries and distilleries. Really cool. So many things to like about the whole, union around the city. But you got to come back to Atlanta. When are you coming back?
As soon as I can. I mean, I don't think I'm as optimistic as, coming back right away. I know you guys are opening up, and, for the economy and the people that need that, that's fantastic. But for us here, I think we're going to probably be in lockdown definitely through the end of this month and probably partially into the next. My sense is it's going to be a while before travel can resume, at least normally. But trust me, as soon as I can, I'm coming back. I had a fantastic time last time.
I vote fourth quarter again. I think that would be great.
All right, that's done. I think that's easily doable.
So we'll have to let you go in a second, but what's the interesting story, or can you say what's something interesting you're working on that people can watch out for in the New York Times in the coming months?
It'll be in some ways continued coverage of what COVID and what's happening with COVID in Mexico. I mean, it's interesting. I started this year with a whole different project mapped out that had nothing to do with the coronavirus. And then quickly around February, it all changed. And that project, which I'd started, had almost 2 months of work under my belt on, was abandoned probably for next year. So it's obviously COVID related. And the challenge we face with that is, as a global newspaper, every story has to live on its own merit. We can't write the same story in Mexico that we wrote in Italy. Hospital saturation. Well, we've seen hospital saturation in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, all over the world. So why is it new and distinct in a place like Mexico? So what we're looking for is ways to write about different phenomenon in Mexico and in the region vis-a-vis coronavirus. And one particular thing that we recently did was, every government worldwide has been underestimating the number of cases. What I found out was that Mexico, while underestimating the cases, also had a much higher count kept by city officials. It was almost 3.5 times higher than the count they were, and this is for people who had died from COVID, 3.5 times higher than what they were doing, what they were presenting publicly. So we published that because it felt like disingenuous. If the government knows 3.5 more times people are dying, that has real implications for the actions people take. Can you imagine if in Atlanta somehow you found out 3 times more people were dying than what was publicly available information?
Pretty wild.
It would really change how people think about, well, yeah, let's stay inside, or let's go outside and buy real estate. So things like that we're going to be focusing on. What differentiates Mexico's response and the region's response from elsewhere in the world.
Man, I really appreciate it. Azam Ahmed, everybody, New York Times bureau chief for Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, good friend of ours, client here at the Wieloch Group of Compass. And we love to say real estate focused, but sometimes there's just interesting people out there that we've had the pleasure to do business with. And of course, we're always happy to hear your perspective, man. Hope you'll be back again. And myself, Jason Wieloch, Lee Taylor at the Wieloch Group of Compass, we're remind you that all of these episodes are live. They're also recorded and saved to our YouTube page and uploaded to Apple and Spotify. And you can find all of the links to that at our website, wielochgroup.com. We're hoping to simplify that site here in the coming weeks a little bit. And if you are looking to buy or sell here in Atlanta, residential property, we're here to help. And we also, as you mentioned, Jordan, down in Miami, we have a really amazing network of agents across the country. So if you have a friend or you yourself need to relocate somewhere else, we can make sure that you work with some of the best people as well. And we've just enjoyed having another great broadcast here on the podcast. So until next week here on Due Diligence, we'll see you then.
Thanks, Azam.
Thank you.